Thank you.
So I was thinking about kicking on this way. So 23andMe, as I recall, is just a little bit younger than my oldest daughter, who turned 17 this year. And so you've seen a lot, and you're basically one of the OGs in this sort of tech plus bio space. And if you had to I'm curious given what you've seen, if you had to give advice to entrepreneurs today who are sort of doing it, if you had to do this today, what would be different? What about now is sort of different than the days when you started?
Ooh, good question. When we started, it was so we were so rebellious, we were seen as so controversial. And I remember actually really clearly, there was one talk I went to and people were talking about whether or not they were going to, give back the genetic information to their customers. And that was really controversial when we first announced that we would do that. People would have access to the raw genome. And, there was issues with the FDA, there was issues with, genomic council, there's issues with everyone. And at this one panel meeting, every single person said oh yeah, of course you should get access to your genome. And I was like, wow, it was a really interesting moment when I was like, wow, the world really changed. And, it was actually, there's one article that was written by the American Society of Human Genetics, and this genetic counselor, it wrote the blog post, and she's like, I remember when 23andMe launched and I was outraged. And, I'm sitting here, it was 6 or 7 years later. She's like, I don't quite remember what was so outrageous.
Mm-hmm.
And so I would say the number one thing, there's been more acceptance about the role of the consumer in healthcare. And people kind of accept that the consumer can play a role, that they can potentially have more information, they can take more responsibility, that more can be actually around the consumer. So the advice I'd give now is in some ways to seize that opportunity. I think there's absolutely a moment where everything is changing. I really feel, and especially with, well, I'm sure we'll talk about this, with this 2020 and everything that changed with virtual care, it's almost like we're the desert, and in 10 years there's going to be Vegas, and you have the opportunity to build it. And so it really is, it's starting from almost nothing, but the role of the consumer in healthcare is so much more widely accepted. And so my opportunity more now is how you don't have to fight that battle, but really now you have this opportunity to seize it, and people should really embrace that.
It's interesting to hear you remember the outrage, because it's reversed now, right? There's reverse outrage, which is a good thing. It's good for patients, good for consumers, that there would be outrage if data were not shared back with them transparently, and if they weren't part of their own healthcare.
Yeah, I mean, I would argue that in some ways it's still not that well done. If you just think about medical records, it's really hard to still get access to your medical record. And I would say one thing I don't know if people realize, if I went to Stanford, or if I went to any hospital system and I said, I want to do an audit of where's all my healthcare information gone, there's not an audit trail the way there is GDPR and CCPA force that with tech companies. And so I would say you potentially have the right, but again, if I wanted to get my medical records, it takes weeks. I'm not really sure where it's all been.
And you get a DVD.
Yeah, you got a DVD. It's not usable.
Yeah.
Not for lack of outrage, though. People are still outraged.
I think if
agreed, though, the
outraged,
infrastructure is missing.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things that I'm eager to see 23 more and more. How do you actually help organize people to have appropriate outrage? Because people are outraged and they're like, oh, the healthcare system's awful, but people don't necessarily know how to mobilize.
Right, and that's where this paradox is, because people are empowered, but they don't know what to do, right? So how's this going to work?
Yeah, it's something I think a lot about, is that how do you, something like medical records, I find it outrageous you can't get access to them. And I had an incident where I had a friend who was, really, a day away from dying, and we couldn't get his medical record, and I was trying to get him transferred. And the only thing I did was tweet. And it was that tweet that actually finally did get him transferred.
Yeah.
but I think, and he ended up dying. And in large part, I think he ended up dying because he did not get the appropriate care for days. So I do think there has to be probably a more effective way of mobilizing, and it's hard right now because healthcare is mostly a B2B area. So like who would consumers go and protest against? And I think one thing to think about, like I had one hospital healthcare like IT system tell me, he's like, look, Anne, the reality is access to health information is the bottom of my list. He's like, why is it the bottom of my list? No one makes their healthcare decision based on transferability of their data. Yeah. And so if consumers actually really wanted, they almost have to say, like, I'm no longer getting care at UCLA. I'm getting care now at UCSF because of how I can access my data. And so I think until there's actually a financial pain, no one's going to actually make a change.
Well, I want to get back to this concept of Vegas out of the desert, because that's really appealing to me. What does your version of this sort of paradise look like? And I mean, what's in it?
Well, I think I'm obviously really biased, and everything for me is in the genetics lens. And the reason why genetics is so interesting is because you have the ability to understand what your inherent risks are. And when I think back in 2003, Francis Collins came out when the first human genome was sequenced, and there was all kinds of fanfare. And it was, the statement that genetics has the opportunity to help people predict, prevent, and treat all disease. And so the idea of being able to potentially diagnose better, to be able to prevent and be able to treat is super appealing. And I think that the healthcare system, like I think about also the controversy that we still run into today. Like if I show up at a medical center with my atrial fib report and I say, look, I'm genetically high risk for atrial fib, the doctors uniformly just turn me away. Like there's nothing, right. like I don't know what to do. The practice of medicine is not around prevention. And frankly, most doctors are really trained not to think of, their patients as being able to change their behavior. It's kind of just sort of like the unwritten rule, like people don't change.
Yeah, and you can't even get them to comply with your orders, with your medicines.
Right. So that there's kind of seen as like people don't change. They don't reply to anything. And I'm actually a believer. I actually think people have this opportunity to change. Like they will change their behavior. They will actually be more compliant. Like there's an opportunity to prevent, but it needs to be in a different way. Like if you want someone to lose weight, or you want if someone has an addiction or some other issue, it's more complicated than just pointing out the problem.
Yeah.
So and that's frankly where your phone is really valuable. Like there's a whole world that can come with behavior change and modifying people. So when I think about the desert that's blooming, I think it really has to do with a world where you can potentially prevent disease. So know about your risks and that you can prevent disease, and where your health is no longer about these episodic annual visits, but it's really the continuum that is strung together with your phone. And also this idea that your healthcare has to come from a one-to-one interaction with a physician, I think is dead. Mm-hmm. I think you absolutely have an opportunity to develop a form of healthcare that can scale, that is not predicated on a one-to-one interaction with a physician.
So what do we need to do to go from here to there? Like, what are the big missing pieces? It sounds like there's an ecosystem that's partially being developed, but that, are there missing pieces? Because, to push back on you, there are people working on prevention. There are people working on behavior change and driven through tech. So is this going to you think it's going to come together, or?
Well, it's a great question. So the number one reason why this is not, I think that there's a barrier, and why I think there's still a real risk that it won't ever happen, is because no one makes money on prevention. Mm-hmm. And no one, I think any healthcare entrepreneur that's out there can understand that anyone who's paying is in the business of trying to figure out what is your 3-year ROI.
Yeah.
You have to show that there is a return on the investment that you're putting in sometime in 3 years. So for instance, like I always thought, like, why not just, everyone when they turn 18, they should have a genetic sequence and you figure out, carrier status testing. Well, that's absolutely not going to ever pay off because it doesn't necessarily have a 3-year ROI. Like you really only want to pay for it when you absolutely have to. So I think that the missing piece in here that I don't have the answer to is how do you actually have a system where the incentives are aligned, where prevention and keeping people healthier actually pays off. And the only systems that really have that is a single payer system or an integrated system like Intermountain, Kaiser, Geisinger, others. So anyone who's taking on risk for, an extended time period. And I think that's part of the issue too, is the insurance, thinking about people in this short-term time periods doesn't allow you to do anything that's a long-term investment.
Yeah, no, well said. And I think what we are seeing though is that there are more companies starting up that want to be scalable Kaiser, whether in Medicare Advantage or other places. It's a hard business to build and it's very capital intensive, obviously.
Right. And I would question, whether or not will the consumer ever pay? That's kind of the big question to me, is like, if you have a system that is actually more built around the best interest of the consumer, is there a way to better engage the consumer? And obviously 23andMe has made a real bet on, being a direct to consumer company, that engaging the consumer will be a path. But I think that's something that, again, looms in my mind, is that you obviously care the most about yourself. No one cares as much about your health as you do.
Yep.
And so if you want to be healthier, then how do I actually engage you?
Well, and then what do you think the solution to that is? I mean, because it's even if you had, let's say, the payer that wanted to do that, I guess it is coming up with the scalable means to do that. And we've also seen things where people want to use AI and chatbots and other things. But in the end, I guess it is what you said in the beginning. It's empowering the patient to be able to know what to do and to be incented to do it, and to understand the rewards, understand the risks, and then go get it done.
Yeah. I mean, this is honestly where I kind of struggle about it. Can you actually really innovate that much within the system? And I don't know. I mean, part of the reason why 23andMe was built the way it was built is because I don't believe that healthcare can innovate from within. Yeah. And partly it's because you make so much money off the inefficiencies that the incentives will never fully align. And so I think that, like, even when I look at Amazon Care and all these things that are happening, it's all innovation within the system, but I don't know how far it can ever really get pushed because of the financial pull that people have that essentially force you to make decisions that are not in your best interest.
Well, does Amazon become Intermountain? Does 23andMe become a payvider?
I don't know. I mean, I think that's where I think somebody has to. I kind of think about this. Who is it who's going to make money on me, being 95 years old and disease free? Like, essentially, if we can answer that question, then I feel like I'm willing to invest in that. But I want somebody who has that kind of long term. And frankly, that's the advantage that the NHS and Sweden and other, single payer systems have. And I think that's where, like, it's really interesting what's happening in the UK with, the genomics programs that they're taking on. They're really running with this, and they have all kinds of discussions coming out now about how they're going to integrate, disease risk scores within primary care. It's super, super interesting. So I think in some ways we might get stuck with a really antiquated system if we don't fully, come up with like a whole new way. But I think the main way is like somebody needs to have a very long-term plan that, and maybe it's life insurance, like some way that it's a very long-term plan that, where people make money off you being, 85 years old and healthy.
Mm-hmm. So Netflix.
Yeah, potentially.
Well, it's a long game.
Honestly, like I think this is where like I often like love pushing on, people who are investing in this space, and say like I don't know realistically how much you can innovate from within the existing guidelines and the system as it is, unless you totally. And my only bet here is like I think I can get people to pay if I'm truly aligned with what's in their best interest.
Yeah. Well,
yeah,
and
the
as
devil's
you talked
to
about
play
earlier,
devil.
You go, Vineeta, go.
I was going to say, to play devil's advocate, if you want to build a system that leverages personal genomics, completely outside of the care ecosystem, and that ultimately incurs the cost of undiagnosed disease or late diagnosed disease, I guess the counter argument is that may be why personal genomics has had sort of a small addressable market outside of the healthcare system as it exists, as compared to, let's say, what the NHS is doing, and and what nationalized healthcare systems might do. So I might push back that maybe the convergence of all the factors that you're describing, Anne, is making this exactly the right time to try to build, genomics-driven medicine within healthcare as we know it today, within the providers and channels and payers that stand to benefit.
Yeah, I still think of, I still look back on the atrial fib example. If I look at, atrial fib runs in the family, and so it's personal to us, and I can see, my dad who has it, and I can see that there's actually things that you can do to potentially prevent. But if you're a 20-year-old, is who's going to pay for the test to begin with? And the payoff is not going to be for potentially 50 years. So what's the advice? When would the 20-year-old who potentially wants to live their life in a new way with this kind of information, when do they get that information? And then how is that integrated? That's kind of where I come back. So I think there's absolutely an opportunity to integrate genomics into healthcare delivery, and we see this happen quite a bit, where people learn that they have a risk of blood clotting and they have heart disease, or they something with pharmacogenetics. There's a lot of different ways that it becomes incredibly valuable. But I also really think about the risk element is going to be applicable to every single person. That is where you talk about Netflix, that's where every single person becomes like Netflix. Everyone has a customized experience on day one.
Well, it's interesting. What you're describing is a failure to generate evidence quickly enough, in a sense, right? Because in the AFib example, we need the data first in some kind of a study, in some kind of a trial, to prove that either anticoagulation or some type of lifestyle change earlier in individuals with a genetic predisposition to AFib, but not an AFib rhythm, does something. And so we almost need to be able to conduct that study faster, cheaper, in a bigger population, which is where I think the 23andMe platform to actually communicate with patients is unbelievable. I can't think of another platform like it.
Right. I think that I do sometimes propose to my research team that we should do a 20-year study to prove out these things. And they're like, oh boy, Anne, that's really, you're killing us. But I think that we would be really well set up. And the reality is if you look at, prevention studies in the UK is amazing at doing some of these. They're really long studies. So you could absolutely come up with surrogate markers and other ways to identify, in heart disease, et cetera, in other areas, or diabetes and hemoglobin A1C, and find ways to measure change. But I think for a lot of them, it's a lifestyle. I mean, it's one thing I tell my kids every day, that your health is a sum of what you've done, of how you've lived your life. So every single day matters. And so I can look at again, my 12-year-old, does it matter if he exercises or not now? We don't really know. But my hunch is everything that you do adds up. Yeah. And so
go ahead.
It's worth having, that's where I think about it's, in skin cancer, it's very clear looking at this. You can show up as a 55-year-old blonde, blue-eyed, freckled individual and want to have a skin check. And you're kind of, it's a little bit what have you already done? There's nothing you can't undo if you spent your time in tanning beds or spent your time getting burns. It's already done. So that's where prevention plays such a huge role. And that clearly in something like skin cancer. And it's important to get people educated there. But that's where I think about every single disease area. How do you know something as clearly as that? And that's where the system as it is not well set up for it. But we absolutely do need those kinds of studies. And we absolutely need to find ways of following people. And again, one of the pieces of advice, going back to your first question, one of the things I would love for people to do more and more is your phone is just so powerful. All kinds of, I love looking at all these companies that are coming. It's so exciting what you can actually do with your phone. And this idea that every single day is a clinical trial and every day is a study, and anyone who's ever been pregnant out there knows, you take medications that are not supposed to be for pregnant people. Every day is so there's a huge opportunity with the phone.
And I just noticed you and Ashley joined the room. So let's bookmark the AFib conversation and come back to it. It'd
You
be really
win.
great to hear his
Yes.
thoughts.
Yeah, we'll pull them up in a little bit. That's a good idea. Well, one area that I know is dear to your heart too is that we haven't gone to yet in just the last few minutes is how all this can affect even the design of new therapeutics. Because I can imagine, either in what you choose to get, how you build clinical trials, how you prescribe drugs, and all that stuff. Is that part of the new Vegas?
That's absolutely, yeah. Again, if you think back on what Francis Collins said about the potential of being able to diagnose and, predict or prevent and treat disease, how can you actually develop therapies in a more effective, more efficient way?
But I think the pushback is, if that's true, why has that not happened, or has it, and we just don't hear about it?
Well, a couple of things. So one, there's pretty good data about how using genetic information means you're over, 2 times more likely to be successful. So if you think about one of the biggest pain points in healthcare is that it's just riddled with failures. So if you're twice as likely to be successful, it's actually a pretty substantial, it's a meaningful number. So the problem in drug discovery is it just takes a long time. So we are, and I think about we have one of the largest data sets out there with over 10 million customers, but we're just scratching the surface. So think about how big, data is that Netflix has or Google has and how they are making sense of it. So we have a substantial data set and we are using them. We're in a partnership now with GSK. I'm really inspired by what we can find, what we can see, but we're just starting on what I think is going to be a whole new world of efficient drug discovery. And I think that's where there's all kinds of opportunities with how you're going to be able to really go from gene to function, and how do you really understand what the gene means and that biology, and then start to understand how could you actually potentially modulate that with a small molecule or an antibody or a gene therapy. So I think, going to your question, I think it's just a matter of time, but I think that's the kind of thing is someone should be documenting that over, the next decade. How is drug discovery going to change?
We are in the middle of it.
Oh, good. Great.
Yeah.
Well, I knew I was talking to you for a reason. I can't wait to see how you're documenting it.
And speaking of looking over decades, if we look back in time over the last decade, I'd be fascinated to hear just your take from the insider's perspective on how consumer genomics or personal genomics has played out. Because I remember when 23andMe launched in the world, for me it was like, okay, this is really cool. This is endlessly fascinating. The addressable market is 100% of people because everyone's got DNA and everyone's going to be super intrigued and interested in what they can learn about themselves if only they had access to their own DNA. But if you sort of roll the tape forward, it seems like one of the biggest killer applications for understanding your own genomics is ancestry. And I probably would, I know I wouldn't have predicted that 10 years ago. In your mind, what has been the sort of the killer app as you've gone to the market and engaged people with their own information? What have you seen that resonates, that matters, that people come back and are looking for more to learn more about? Is it ancestry? Is it health? Is it other?
So I would say that you you sound almost like the early launch team. When we launched our product, we're like, of course, everyone wants their genome. Isn't everyone just pounding at the door, excited to get their genetic information? And do you want to peruse all the various literature and see what that means for you? So what we discovered is that market, the reason why you potentially want to get your genome was not obvious to the majority of the world. And so we absolutely, I always tell this story, is we launched, we were the cover of the New York, front page of the New York Times. We were covered of Wired, we had so much press, and we sold probably 1,000 kits that first day. And then after that, it kind of petered down to 10 to 15 kits a day. And I remember thinking wow. This is not good. This is not the universal market demand that we anticipated. And that's when I realized that the scientists, we all think this is so interesting. And it was just very clear. It was not obvious why most people want to get access to this information. So what was amazing, so again, that's part of like the hard part of being an entrepreneur, is like you have to keep persevering. And for us, it was like there's clearly something really interesting here, but it's going to take time to evolve. So I totally agree with you. Ancestry was not on my radar. Like we always had an ancestry product and we had a health product, but and I knew like ancestry was always really fun. And we had this dream, like my ex-husband used to say, like, oh, one day you'll connect people and they'll find family members. And we're like, oh, that was such a distant dream. And I think the things that surprised me is just how much your genetic ancestry was going to surprise people. And how
in terms
much,
of finding roots that they didn't know they had.
Yeah. In terms of like, there's a disconnect between what people see in the mirror and what the family lore has been and what your genetic ancestry says. And also a total disconnect. Like I had no idea how many people would find family members, including myself, like where we found a first cousin, like no idea just how like fascinating it would be for people and how much people would be learning about themselves. And I think one thing again, I never would have expected is that we get into the conversation on race, which has been like a huge area for us. Sorry, go on.
Yeah, what's your favorite story there? I know I've heard you say so many interesting ones. I don't know if there's one that you want to highlight here.
Oh, there's so many. I mean, I think it's, this is back from the very, very early days. And it also speaks to the culture of the company and how we approach science. But I had somebody wrote in, again, very early on and said, I've been in Silicon Valley. I'm adopted. I've been in Silicon Valley my whole life. Like I am, like she was very successful here. She's like, I did 23andMe and I find that I'm part of the Arctic Inuit community and, part of the reindeer tribe. And I'm quitting my job and I'm going to move there to learn about the community. And she wrote back a couple of years later and said, like, I've never been, more happy. I feel connected for the first time in my life. I have a sense of like, I feel like I have my family. I'm with my people. Like I feel complete for the first time. And I took this letter to my research team. And I was like, you guys, you better be right, because this woman just changed her whole life and her identity and everything is tied to her genetics. And so I think that was like such an important moment to me, because it made me realize how much, this information that we're providing, it's not a novelty. It's not, your Neanderthal score can be fun and it's cocktail party, but like, this is not just a cocktail party conversation. It's like, it's your identity. It's who you are. It is looking in the mirror. It's like knowing your entire history and your background. Like, I can't emphasize enough, like how much it's you and it's your whole past and your lineage. And so it's really important. Like it really, like one of our core values in the company is lead with science. And I really like every aspect of the company has to follow through, because behind every data point that we have, like every customer experience is so unique and so meaningful. So it's really like and we have every single day, every day I get a story. Like I just have to tell one other story that I just love is like one of my customers who wrote in, who again, the family asked if they could expedite her sample because she was in her 20s and she was on hospice and she was going to die. And again, my team, it's really hard to expedite samples and such, but we managed to like get her data. And her mom said like it was such an emotional experience for her to see herself in black and white. And she ended up dying the next day. But she's like, it was so important for her to get that information before she died. And so it's really like, it's one of the things like it's what makes me come to the office every day. Like we have a product that's incredibly meaningful for people.
Yes. Well, so Anne, I want to do one thing, which is I want to switch gears by bringing up some people from the audience to chat. And so Venkat's going to start helping drive that. And as they come up, I got one last question for you in this sort of half. which is that I think, the story of 23andMe and FDA is one of the most impressive founder comeback stories that I know, and love to hear your take on it. I think I remember maybe even briefly talking to you about it in the middle of it. Talking to
Yeah.
my Stanford colleagues like Russ Altman. Professor Altman with an A was one of the first people on the list of the SAB and got a lot of calls, as I recall. Like what all that was like for you. You were trying to push the boundaries in all the good ways, but then this happens.
Yeah, it's interesting because in my mind, like we got the warning letter. We got the warning letter on a Friday, and part of the hard thing sometimes of doing something totally new is that it exactly the regulatory world was unclear, and we had gotten lots of different letters. Like we had gotten a letter from the Department of Health of California. We'd gotten a letter from senators. There'd been hearings. And we had actually spent time in the past. We'd spent time with Kessler. We'd spent time with von Eschenbach. Like von Eschenbach was the last one who made it really clear, like, we are not regulating you. So it's interesting. I do this class every year at Stanford with Rob Siegel. And he always asks his students, like, did 23andMe get their warning letter because of Silicon Valley arrogance or just incompetence? And it's amazing how everyone says arrogance. And I always say, like,
was there not a third option?
No, it was only one of those two. It's like there's a minimal choice for them. So the reality is we had tried to engage. And the number one thing that we made the mistake on, like I look back at my communications with the FDA and it's almost laughable. So we weren't speaking the right language. I didn't necessarily know. In a very Silicon Valley way, the FDA would say, we need to see 20 samples to validate this. And we'd say, well, statistically, you only need 17, and here's why. And one of the first things that our head of regulatory taught us is that, it's kind of, you need to take the feedback you get from the FDA. It needs to be like, it's a fact. It's like the DMV. When you go to the DMV, you do not negotiate. You don't say oh, I got to go to the bathroom, hold my place in line, or hey, I don't want to take the vision test. Like, you do what they ask and you follow the rules. And there's a similarity there. And we had, again, we didn't speak the language. So when we got the letter on a Friday, and then it was made public on a Monday, which was unusual. And to be honest, I didn't recognize right away what a big deal it was. And it was Kessler who actually called me, and he's the one who made it clear, Anne, I know you're not taking this seriously and you need to, they're really pissed. And I didn't, it's interesting because it's seen as a monumental moment. It was never a question in my mind that there wasn't a path forward, because everything that we're doing, we were really trying to find the right path forward. And I had great confidence in my product. I had a strong team of advisors. I felt confidence in the data quality. I felt confident in the science, but that there was really, it was a disconnect in terms of process. So I spent a lot of time, getting advice, talking to people. I had one FDA advisor who, the first email I sent her, she essentially sent me an email back saying there was no one on the planet that she would rather not help than me. And that I had, taken, real resources from real scientists. And I just, over a series of emails, I actually got her to come into the office. And we had a very reasonable dialogue about what would need to happen. And that's kind of where there was a little bit of, sometimes it's good to push. And this was an opportunity, we really needed to listen. And we had to, be able to say, we had to go back to the very basics and get a first report approved. And we knew it was going to be a long haul. And one of the things that we were really lucky about is that we had cash. And I think just emphasizing the company is there's nothing, you can't manage. If we hadn't had cash, it would have been tough. So again, part of, for me, it was never a question about whether or not we were going to be able to come back. It was really a question about finding the right people and then doing what the FDA asks. And what the FDA wants is they want data. And we are actually very, very good at generating data. And we took the approach that we were going to prove out that this product was acceptable, that it, like, consumers can get it, and that is highly accurate. And we were incredibly persistent.
Yeah. No, that advice of listening and responding and just persevering, that probably that's what gets you through it. That makes a lot of sense. That's such a beautiful story.
Yeah, as an external observer of that whole thing, and I have to say, you guys, you specifically managed that balance between grit and grace in navigating through that whole thing, because I can't imagine how scary that must have been once it did eventually dawn on you all how serious this was. So
yeah,
what an incredible entrepreneurial story.
Well, I think it's a good, and again, even just hearing you emphasize that, Vijay, it's an important moment to recognize when you do just need to listen and then follow the instructions. Yes. And I think that sometimes I see, like, even when I'm investing in, like, in founders or like company, like, they'll argue with you, and it's fun to argue, but there's at times where you're just like, you're just wrong and you just need to follow. And that's kind of what we did.
Yep. Well, so we got some guests on stage here now too. You got people who you probably know, Anne. I think about Shri, Atul, you, and Hammer. So I don't know if any of new speakers here want to jump in with a question.
Why don't we start with Shri first?
Sure, and this has been really great, and thanks for hosting everyone. But I had a quick question about how you think about the technology stack as you move from more consumer health to maybe healthcare and discovery. Like, do you see maybe the genomic technologies changing or the phenotype technologies, and how do you know when to pull the trigger on those things?
Yeah, that is actually, I'd say, one of the most common questions we get, and especially with anyone who has a science background, they definitely are most interested in why are we not on the next generation array or next generation sequencing. And what we have found, it's interesting, and I don't know if you're invested in any of these areas or if you've had other speakers on, the whole genome sequencing market has not taken off in a direct-to-consumer capacity. And frankly, that's because if I look at, if I offered a whole genome to everyone in this audience, 1 to 3% would learn something new. And 1 to 3% is meaningful, but that means 99 to 97% of you are going to get back the same information that you're going to get from a genotyping array. And the genotyping array is much cheaper than a whole genome sequencing still. And I don't see whole genome sequencing prices coming down in any kind of rapid speed. So what we've done instead is we biobank our customers. We ask them if they want to opt into biobank. The majority of customers say yes. And if someone is interesting for some reason, we always have the potential to go back and do sequencing. And so we use sequencing for research quite a bit, but the reality I find is it's much more nimble to use genotyping data than it is to use a whole genome. And from a consumer perspective, the primary value is in the data that we can actually generate from a genotyping array. I don't know if anyone wants to disagree on that, because I know, again, there's a lot of people who push on next generation sequencing quite a bit, but that has been our stance.
Yeah, I think it already makes a ton of sense, at least until that price goes down and until there's a reason to prove that you need what you could get from it.
Right. And I'd say for people who come with a specific disease area, like if you say I have a hereditary cancer, or I have, I want to see if we have hereditary hypertrophic cardiomyopathy or other issues, like there's absolutely a reason. But we find as a screen, it just hasn't made sense for us to introduce anything but the array.
I think it goes back to your argument about timescale at which you get to see a return on the profiling, right? It's what strikes me about this market as interesting is that we do pay for genetic testing in the context of carrier screening, in the context of, let's say, an array-based genotyping, in the context of, say, cancer risk predisposition, in the context of, say, subsequent workup for a rare diagnosis. And yes, each of those numbers get smaller and so on. But in the course of a patient's life, for some larger than 1% of patients, they are accessing genetic information that could otherwise be a derivative of a whole genome sequence, but it's like, I don't know if you agree with this, it seems like the labs as well as the beneficiaries of that sequencing and the stakeholders involved at each step are so different that we've fragmented it a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
But it makes sense from your perspective at 23andMe.
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing, for instance, that's an interesting, and this is where I feel like there's opportunities, like any of our customers who are carriers for cystic fibrosis, their partners, where if they're potentially considering having children, probably should be sequenced on a more comprehensive prenatal screen, because you don't know whether or not they potentially have, you already know that there's one mutation, and you could have compound het of a somebody who has a more rare variant, and we have seen those types of things come up. So I think that's where there's potentially arguments to saying, like, the more people learn about, like, have a screen, and then that can trigger for people who is it who potentially needs to have any kind of deeper sequencing. And so I think, again, going back to the system, and this is also a structural issue, physicians are not trained on genetics, and physicians also don't make money on any kind of test. So they'll make money on procedures, but if they prescribe a genetic test, they're not making money on it. And so for that reason, I think it's been harder to drive adoption as well, because it's creating more work without any kind of pay return.
It might be worth saying, thanks for having me up on the speaker stand here. This is exciting. I saw my phone said some of my favorite people were all having a conversation. So here I am. It's good to talk to you. Might be worth saying, and we were talking about this a few weeks ago, but sequencing, of course, can now be the full depth sequencing, probably about $500 for a whole genome there, where you cover each spot in the genome 30 or 40 times. But you can also these days just do low pass sequencing, which is to say you cover each spot in the genome 1 or 2 times. And that can get you the same information as the microarray, actually a little bit more in some settings with the same infrastructure. And that still allows you to basically fuel things like these polygenic risk scores. And I wondered if you as Vineeta was saying, you at 23andMe have done, I think, as good a job at anyone that is explaining difficult concepts in genetics and medicine to regular people. What do you think about integrating that genetic information with the more regular clinical information? Like we've been talking about the scores for heart disease. Sounded like you're talking about atrial fibrillation scores too. Mm-hmm. Is that an area you're thinking of moving into, where you can have patient delivered data that then gets integrated with the genetics to give you back a more precise estimate, say, of heart attack risk or something similar?
Well, so if I understand the question correctly, there's 2 aspects of it. So one, low pass sequencing is super interesting. I have not seen anyone get an FDA authorization yet for that. So I mean, the one beauty of genotyping is the accuracy, because you can build in all kinds of redundancy in the array. So I feel really, really good with it. And I think low pass sequencing is super interesting. And I'm just eager to see how the accuracy holds up. So I'd say that's one thing. Second, in terms of the clinical side, I think when we got we have 6 FDA authorizations now. When we got those FDA authorizations, they really started to get us more and more into the clinical realm. And what's interesting for me is a world, and again, we talked about like the Vegas, like we're essentially still in the desert of the new healthcare world. And I think that it's going to grow, and it's going to get populated from both a consumer landscape, being like consumers are going to generate clinical data, and then the existing healthcare system will generate clinical data, and the two will have to merge in some way. So I absolutely think people will start to show up in their doctor's offices with a polygenic risk score for atrial fib or coronary artery disease, and it will not have been ordered by the physician that they're seeing, but they'll want it to be in their medical record in some way. And frankly, like, I think that is a problem in the system. And I don't know yet how that's going to be solved, because medical records today are not really well set up to take in external data. And they're also not set up for genetic information. And I think also there's probably still a skepticism from a lot of physicians about anything that the consumer is bringing to them. So it's actually an interesting question to go back to, because we actually do have these reports. Like, we have all of these polygenic risk scores out there now. We have the coronary artery disease, we have atrial fib, we have, the type 2 diabetes. And so how from a clinical setting. Now, as people walk into their office, or walk into a physician's office, how does the clinician actually start to respond?
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. And just because I think it has to fit into the current workflow is the key. And the problem is, at the moment, I think our general practitioners aren't ready to see a standalone polygenic risk score, because they're not quite sure what to do with it. But they do almost every day, though, when they talk about heart attack risk, calculate a different kind of score, which integrates these other clinical parts. So I think if there's a way to be able to combine those two, just as you said, if people now have their clinical information, let's say from their medical record on their phone, and then let's say they also have their 23andMe data on their phone, there should be a way that both of the apps, let's say from their clinical provider and from 23andMe, can calculate that score and give them an integrated score that could then be shown to the GP in a way that would have to be backed by the appropriate professional body before the professional bodies would get behind it. But there is a way to integrate that on the back end that it could be seamless. And that's the world I think that we're all kind of dreaming about.
I think I think that's a really interesting world that's coming. And I think there's one question, because you bring this up, Ewan, you say like the professional bodies need to adopt it. And I look at, genetics, like I was a little bit depressed when I saw that it was the 20th anniversary of the human genome being sequenced, because I feel like it's been 20 years and outside of cancer, genetics is just not broadly used. And it's kind of depressing. Like how do you start to drive adoption? And like, how do you actually start to get, like, I see so much utility, especially like pharmacogenetics, and again, a lot of monogenic, variants that have clinical meaning, but it's not well adopted. And so that's why I do wonder, do we have to wait for the societies to adopt before it can really start to get integrated?
Well, part of it is to connect the dots of everything we were just talking about. There has to be something in it for people to develop these new technologies. I mean, we have to figure out how people get paid for this. If there is a way that there is, let's say, a way to get reimbursed for preventative or value-based care, then to Ewan's point, people will come up with, cheaper genomics, whether it be arrays or lower pass or whatever. Those become just obviously details in the bigger picture of how people are competing to do the same thing better. But that's the fundamental part that we just don't have. And I think until we have that, or we don't have enough, I think we will be sort of going around in circles. And it is a scary sort of Ghost of Christmas Future tale that Anne lays out, that if we don't do it, we will be left behind. So I
wonder about some, this is also part of how the lobbying and leveraging consumers, like maybe physicians should make money off prescribing genetic testing.
Yep.
That would absolutely drive demand.
Yep. I want to get a few people into, because we're running out of time. So Hammer, did you have a question that you wanted to jump in with?
Absolutely. And thank you. This has been a fascinating conversation. And I had a question concerning to see if you have an opinion regarding modern day Egyptians who are, relying on DNA tests to trace back their connection to, ancient Egypt. And there's been, a great amount of debate in that area. And that debate stretches all the way back here to America, in particular African Americans, who are, again, looking to research our history and our DNA. And so there was a test that was done. It was 151 mummies, and I think they had 160 samples from one location, and they published a paper and utilized that to try to justify a narrative or position on the history of modern day Egyptians and their DNA. So I was wondering, first of all, the question of veracity, because again, when you start talking about people relying on DNA and genetic testing, because we all have social media and information is available to the world, people form opinions. And so I was wondering, do you have a position or an opinion regarding that published paper and tracing back modern day Egyptian history to ancient Egypt?
So I don't. It's a great question, because it kind of goes to the beginning of the talk of how much, ancestry has been something that people really identify with, and it's really important to them. And one thing that we have learned is, just how cautious we also need to be, because people really do glom onto that. I mean, you just see the Elizabeth Warren discussions of Native American, like all these things are really important to get right. So I don't know the paper specifically that you're talking about. Sample size seems small, and I don't know how much DNA they actually got. But I know one of the things that is really interesting to us is having really great reference populations. So meaning like people who have been living in a certain area and have their grandparents from an area, as well as some of these old historical data sets. Some of this old, ancient DNA that has been, worked on actually with a number of team at Stanford as well. But I haven't seen this paper, but it's certainly interesting, and it certainly is the type of thing customers are really interested in. I just don't know enough about the veracity of it and exactly how they got the information.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks,
MC.
Thank you. Part of the power of Clubhouse is of like MC Hammer and team at a16z. This is so much fun. And I don't know if you remember, but back in the day, this is years and years ago, when we all met in person in these things called conferences, you and I were walking.
And a long time ago.
You're giving me some startup advice when we were in Startup Land, and you had some really good advice about not waiting for other people to give you permission to do the things you want to do. Mm-hmm. So my question to you is, what's the best piece of advice you've received as an entrepreneur, and that you think somebody else should also listen? Because we've got a bunch of builders and entrepreneurs in the room here.
Oh, that's a good one. It's kind of hard to think about. I mean, I do think that not necessarily following all the rules is good. There's so many little ones. I don't have anything brilliant off the top of my head, I have to say.
How about the best advice for founders who want to, kind of use genetics to do good for the world, which was sort of the vision that you started with, right? I guess per Vijay's observation 17 years ago. What's different now?
Well, listen, I think some of the things that I have that are like super practical. So again, sometimes you get pie in the sky advice, and like there's things that are really practical here. So one thing I say that seems to always be really surprising to companies when I talk to them, and this like may or may not be, this may or may not, you guys might not love this advice, is like, I always tell founders, like, be super honest. Like, I don't want to see a veneer when they do their management presentation. I want them to be honest. And like your investors, you almost need to shake out the investors that like really, really want to be part of your story for the long run. And, so many people, like when I think about the history, part of the reason why 23andMe is where it is today is because I've had great investors. I actually they've been like, I am really, really clear, like almost too clear of like was not looking to go public. I was not looking to, have an immediate outcome. Like I was like totally open to having bumps in the road and making sure that you're like really honest. It's almost like dating. Like you don't want to get in the relationship under the wrong pretenses. So I think it's one of the most important things that is frankly like super practical, but it's often overlooked, because if you get the wrong investors, you can destroy your company. And so having the right team that's like really aligned and really believes in what you're doing, and you being really transparent with them about it, is really critical. Like I can't emphasize enough. If I hadn't had the right supportive investors, we would not have been able to weather the storms that we had.
Oh, well said. Well said. No, I think that aligns with our perspective very much as well. I think we have just time for probably one more question. Atul, do you want to jump in with something?
Yeah, sure. So first of all, long-time listener, first-time caller, I suppose. And just to say one point, so this is great. And I want to push back on one point first, but the medical data, look, all of our health systems are exporting clinical data in FHIR format. Any patient can get to it. You can easily get to it from the Apple Health app, Health Kit, or Common Health if you want to build your own app. there are really very few patient-oriented downstream decision support tools. So greenfield for all the entrepreneurs listening in. The data is there. It's getting better. Notes are coming next year or within the next year. And the non-structured data, like the images, yeah, it comes in DVD. It's probably a little bit too much to go through an Epic portal, but that's all commonly done. So I think that's still an opportunity there. But Anne, I'm gonna ask you a question about I'm super worried about the necessity of genetics data in drug discovery. Because when I look now, I think we have thousands and thousands of genes now associated with diseases, right? Some are strong, some are weak, some common, some rare. You know, the modern OMIM is humongous. How that yields a drug is still really hard to me. Is genetics still going to be demonstrable as a vital component in drug discovery? I look at Regeneron with so many major early investments in genetics with Geisinger and others. You know, PCSK9 was there before those deals. Can we even say Regeneron really benefited from their genetic sequencing pipelines with all of these partners? I mean, is this really still going to be a part of drug discovery?
I think it's still, so I would say that the historical data, that there are now numerous publications that support that using human genetics makes you, you know, twice or more likely to be successful. So that's all retrospective. I think that it's still too early to look at what Regeneron has done and what we have done. But I absolutely believe that there is a world of being able to go from gene to function and having unique insights in human biology because of the genetic associations that we can see. That does give us, you know, an opportunity to develop truly novel therapeutics. So, I mean, the thing that I have found fascinating, again, when I was investing back in, you know, 2000, 2001, it was the full era of human genome science, Insight, Millennium. And when we started the company, you know, genetics had a bad rap. It was sort of seen as like, oh, we tried that and it didn't work. And the reality is any technology, like even antibodies went through this, you know, hype and then dip and then it comes back. And frankly, you know, gene therapy did as well. It takes time. So I absolutely believe that genomics is going to be, it's a very important tool, but it's not going to be everything. It's not going to solve all the problems, but it will absolutely be a huge complement in the very complicated world of therapeutic development.
Thank you, Anne. Thank you, Atul. So we're right on the hour. And so we should probably wrap it up. And thank you, Anne, so much for joining us, having such a fantastic conversation. I had one last question on the way out, which is that you recently jumped off a hot air balloon to celebrate something. How was that? And what was that experience like?
Oh, me? I did not jump off a hot air balloon. I am a mother of 3 and one small child. And
okay, I've been misinformed.
Yeah, that sounds that, I mean, again, that's something I would have done before the children, but
yes.
No, there have been, no, I don't know if that could have gotten confused.
And this was, I think this is a suspected Richard Branson move. You know, we thought you and Richard, we thought to celebrate, you know, would do that. That's what we thought, you know. These are rumors, strictly rumors.
You know, it's funny because he had that, remember that TV show he had where he talked about how he was like climbing up a hot air balloon and I kept thinking while we were doing the deal, like, I really hope he doesn't try to make me do anything crazy like that. So I am, again, my risk tolerance has dropped in terms of like really potentially fatal flaw outcome events. So no, hopefully.
Your whole day-to-day is all about risk and Bayesian. So I think you're making a smart move here. With that, I think it's probably a good place to end it. Thank you so much. And everybody have a good night. Thank you.
Thanks, bye.
Thank you, Anne.
Thank you. Thank you, Anne.
Good night.
Bye.
Good night. Bye.